Okay, Site 22, Unit 1, Part 4. We're talking about the Nazification process that Hitler took Germany through. So we just finished talking about this extraordinary fact that the Olympics were held in Nazi Germany, right? Despite international protests, there was no boycott. It happened. And the sort of larger message there is that this is sort of rationalizing, justifying, reifying, the Nazis as a legitimate government, right? So the international community is kind of giving their tacit support by participating. So, okay, move along a couple of years. March 1938, Lebensraum, right? This is Hitler's push for more land. Germany takes over Austria without bloodshed. They called it the Anschluss, which is the political union. And it occurred with the overwhelming approval of the Austrian people. There were a lot of German-speaking people in Austria, and many of them felt like their roots were German anyway. Nobody protested this. You can see, people lining the streets giving the German soldiers flowers and stuff. Nobody protested this, despite the fact that it was a violation of the Treaty of Versailles, right? They weren't even supposed to have an army, never mind take over other countries. So that's March, that's the spring of 38. September 38, Hitler's now eyeing the northwestern area of Czechoslovakia, called the Sudetenland. You see it's colored in there, kind of pinkish. In that part of Czechoslovakia, there were a lot of German-speaking people. And so he felt like they were really part of Germany. Now, he didn't want to march in until he was pretty sure that France and Britain wouldn't intervene. So first, he kind of underwent this diplomatic process of meeting with Neville Chamberlain, who was the British Prime Minister, and basically saying, if you don't let me have this, we're going to end up with a war on our hands. Then at the Munich conference, he prevails upon Britain, France, and Italy to agree to the cessation of Sudetenland. So the Western powers, like I said, chose appeasement rather than military confrontation. So we have Neville Chamberlain, we have Daladier, we have Hitler, Mussolini, Ciano, representing some of the big countries in Europe, basically saying, okay, you can have it. So he took it. They occupied the Sudetenland October 15th, 1938. And for the most part, just like with Austria, they were greeted as liberators and heroes. People threw them parades. People threw flowers at their feet as the military marched through the city centers. Okay. Now in Germany, open anti-Semitism became increasingly accepted. And this kind of reached a peak, reached a climax in what's known as the Night of Broken Glass, or Kristallnacht, which happened on November 9th, 1938. I do have a firsthand account to share with you, so that will be posted below the lecture videos, so do take a look at that. But basically, it was an organized night of vandalism, where Jewish shops had windows smashed, Jewish homes had windows smashed, synagogues were set on fire, and so on, right? Across Germany. And you see some of the consequences. So how did this happen? Well, Joseph Goebbels was the propaganda minister, and yes, that was his title. He initiated this free-for-all against the Jews, during which nearly 1,000 synagogues were set on fire, 76 were completely destroyed across Germany and the acquired territories, more than 7,000 Jewish businesses and homes looted during Kristallnacht, about 100 Jews killed, as many as 30,000 Jews arrested and sent to prisons or concentration camps, many of whom remained there for months. So it was an organized, government-sanctioned, government-initiated act of local terrorism. Within days of Kristallnacht, the Nazis forced the Jews to transfer their businesses to Aryan hands, right? Basically saying Jews are not allowed to have businesses. they expelled all the Jewish kids from the public schools. And they further persecuted the Jews by forcing them to pay the damages that had accrued during Kristallnacht. So not only were they targeted during Kristallnacht, but they had to pay to clean up afterwards. Fined $400 million by the German government and barred from owning and running businesses. 1939, September 1, Hitler invades Poland, which officially starts World War II because now England and France really can't turn a blind eye anymore, right? These are some images from the invasion. Two days later, Britain and France declare war on Germany, right? This is from the San Diego Union. Now, Hitler's armies used a tactic that they called blitzkrieg, which means lightning war. And it's a combination of armored attack accompanied by air assault. And before British and French power could even be brought to bear, Poland collapsed. So within days, they just hammered it so hard from the sky and from the land, that it surrendered. We see these terrible images of Warsaw after the Nazi invasion. Germany's military conquest put it in a position to establish what they called the New Order in Poland, which was basically a plan to abuse and eliminate so-called undesirables, notably Jews and people they called Slavs, who they perceived to be from sort of inferior genetic stock. More on all that later. Let's talk a little bit about the ghettos. So confining Jews in ghettos, neighborhoods that only Jews could live in, was not Hitler's brainchild. For centuries, Jews had faced persecution, and they were often forced to live in designated areas called ghettos. And the Nazis' ghettos differed, however, in that they were like a preliminary step towards the annihilation of the Jews, rather than just a method of isolating them from the rest of society. So step one, right, was to round the Jews up and get them to live in particular designated areas so that they would be easier to round up and send to concentration camps and death camps later. Right? So we see these images of life in the ghettos. There wasn't enough food. There was overcrowding. More on those later on. As the war against the Jews progressed, the ghettos became this transition area, this holding area, this collection point for deportation to death camps and concentration camps. They probably didn't start out that way, but that's what they became. 1939, Hitler incorporated the western part of Poland into Germany, right, according to race doctrine. So people who seemed to be Aryan, according to these bizarre criteria, were considered the Volk. But anybody else, Jews and Slavs, were not. And he intended that Poles were to become the slaves of Germany. The Slavs, the ethnic Poles, were to become kind of slave labor, and that the 2 million Jews who were in Poland were to be concentrated in ghettos in Poland's larger cities. So we're looking at the expansion of Germany in this map, right? The red is Germany in 1933. The pink is 1939, that gets added. And then the orange is added 1943 with the general government in Warsaw, the new kind of order. So all of these ghettos sprang up in Eastern Europe. Every dot is a ghetto there. And later, as I mentioned, this would simplify transport to death camps. Nazi occupation authorities officially told the story that Jews were natural carriers of disease, especially typhus, and so therefore it was necessary to isolate them from the Polish community. So that was their cover story, right? Jewish neighborhoods thus were transformed into prisons. The 5 major ghettos were located in Warsaw, in Łódź, in Krakow, in Lublin, and Lviv. I do have a little video clip from the Holocaust Museum's archives of the Warsaw Ghetto, so I will have that down below. Make sure you look at it. There's Lodz. So you'll notice here, right? They would divide up, a chunk of the city and wall it off or fence it off. And behind the fence, the Jews could live. And you'll see here that they had to go over this bridge to get to the other side of this street. Non-Jews could go on the street, but the Jews had to go over the bridge. Okay. There's Krakow rounding people up. Lublin. Lublin again. The view. Okay, so they were rounding up the Jews and making them live in these ghettos, these fenced off areas. November 23rd, 1939, the guy that was put in charge of Poland under the Nazis, at least a big chunk of it, was called Hans Frank. He was the general governor for the general government, occupied Poland. And he issued an ordinance that Jews 10 years of age and older living there had to wear the Star of David on armbands or pinned to their chest or their back, which made their identification easier once there were orders about rounding up Jews and forcing them into the ghettos. So that's where the yellow stars kind of began. In total, we're looking at 1940 now, the Nazis established 356 ghettos in Poland, occupied Soviet Union, the Baltic states, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, between 1939 and 1945, right? So over 6 years. Now, each ghetto was different. There was no uniformity there. The ghettos in small towns were generally not sealed off. They were just kind of temporary residences until the residents could be sent to bigger ghettos. But larger cities had closed ghettos. They built brick walls or stone walls or wooden fences, sometimes using barbed wire to define the boundaries. So there they are sealing off the Warsaw Ghetto with a wall. Right there we see this fence that goes right down the middle of a street. And on one side, the Jews were allowed to live. On the other side, it was the other folks. There are some guards at the Warsaw Ghetto, right? So this was enforced. Guards would stand strategically at gateways and other boundary openings. Jews weren't allowed to leave the Jewish residential districts under penalty of death. There again, we see a walled off zone. Right? Now, the ghettos had the most appalling, inhumane living conditions. The smallest ghetto housed about 3,000 people. Warsaw, the largest ghetto, held about 400,000 people within 1.3 square miles, with an average of 7.2 people per room. So terrible overcrowding. They didn't have fuel for warmth. They had to burn furniture, and when the furniture was gone, they just went cold. People froze to death. There wasn't food. It was appalling. 1941. So initially, many of the ghetto dwellers were from the local area or from neighborhood villages. But in October 1941, general deportations began from Germany to major ghettos in Poland and further east. So they started to deport the German Jews to these ghettos in the east, sending them into Poland, right? And Jews from Austria and Bohemia and Moravia, which was part of Czechoslovakia, they were sent to the ghettos too. So in 1941, all these people from foreign places started to be sent to these Polish ghettos. And they didn't speak the language, right? They were already overcrowded. So it was just wretched. The ghettos were filthy. There was extreme overcrowding, which facilitates disease. Disease was rampant. People couldn't stay warm. This was Poland. They have bitter, cold winters. There wasn't enough warm clothing. There wasn't enough heating fuel. People starved to death. These are dead people. Just people would drop on the streets, right? And others would just walk by them. Now, kind of amazingly, even in the midst of these terrible conditions, many ghetto dwellers resisted dehumanization. They continued to try to assert their humanity. Parents continued to educate their kids, although it was considered illegal. So there were like secret schools. And here you see a group of kids meeting for school, right? Some residents secretly continued to hold religious services, which also was illegal, and to observe Jewish holidays, which was illegal. Now, the Nazis established a kind of model ghetto in northwestern Czechoslovakia called Terezin or Terezinstadt. And it was for propaganda purposes. So they had postcards showing, look at this beautiful place that we're sending the Jews to, right? As a way to kind of placate the international community because rumors were circulating about the terrible conditions in the ghettos. So they showed them Terezinstadt. There was even a propaganda film showing people living relatively comfortably in Terezinstadt. Flower gardens, cafes, schools, all of these things were built to demonstrate to visiting inspectors and audiences of the propaganda films that things were humane. The ghettos were not terrible places. It was all a lie, of course. So I do have a clip from a propaganda film. I'll put that down below. Make sure you take a look at that. Terezin was also a transit camp for people who were later sent to Auschwitz and other death camps, which we will talk more about in a little bit. So let's pause here, and then we will talk about undertaking the liquidation of the ghettos. See you in the next piece.